The crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across the mahogany-paneled walls of the Grandview Corporate Center's executive floor. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sparkled like scattered diamonds against the velvet night sky. The quarterly board meeting had concluded hours ago, but the real business was just beginning in the private conference room that had been transformed into an exclusive poker lounge. Smoke from expensive cigars curled lazily toward the vaulted ceiling while the soft clinking of poker chips created a rhythmic symphony that spoke of serious money-changing hands. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The table was surrounded by the city's most influential figures, real estate moguls, tech entrepreneurs, and investment bankers whose net worth could fund small countries. At the head of the table sat Victoria Sterling, her platinum blonde hair swept into a perfect chignon, her emerald silk blouse complementing the cold intelligence in her green eyes. Victoria was more than just another wealthy player at this table. At 32, she had already transformed her late father's modest construction company into Sterling Enterprises, a billion-dollar empire that dominated the city's skyline. Her buildings rose like monuments to ambition, each one a testament to her ruthless business acumen and her ability to crush anyone who dared challenge her authority. Tonight, she was in her element, cards dancing between her manicured fingers as she calculated odds with the same precision she used to calculate quarterly profits. The stakes at this table weren't just about money, though the pot had already swelled to over $200,000. This was about power, influence, and the unspoken hierarchy that governed their exclusive world. Victoria had been dominating the game for the past 3 hours, her stack of chips towering over the others like skyscrapers dwarfing suburban homes. Her laugh was sharp and predatory as she raked in another substantial win, her eyes scanning the defeated faces around the table with undisguised satisfaction. "Gentlemen," Victoria purred, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had never truly known defeat, "I do hope you've brought more than just your egos to tonight's game. My chips seem to be multiplying faster than your excuses." The other players shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs. Marcus Webb, a silver-haired oil executive, loosened his tie and tried to maintain his composure despite losing nearly $50,000 in the last hour. Sarah Chen, the youngest tech mogul in the room at 28, drummed her fingers nervously on the table's felt surface, her usual startup confidence wavering under Victoria's relentless psychological pressure. But it was the figure standing silently in the corner of the room who caught the attention of those observant enough to notice him. David Rodriguez moved with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to being invisible, his weathered hands gripping a worn mop handle as he methodically cleaned the already spotless marble floors. His navy blue janitor's uniform was pressed but faded, the Grandview maintenance logo on his chest pocket slightly frayed from countless washings. To the power brokers at the poker table, David might as well have been furniture, useful but forgettable, present but insignificant. They discussed their multi-million-dollar deals and personal scandals without any awareness of his presence, their voices carrying across the room as if he were deaf as well as invisible. David had learned long ago that being overlooked was both a blessing and a curse in a building where secrets were currency and information could topple empires. He had been working the night maintenance shift at Grandview Corporate Center for nearly 4 years, arriving each evening as the executives departed in their luxury cars and staying until dawn broke over the city's concrete horizon. His routine was as predictable as clockwork: empty the trash bins, vacuum the carpets, dust the furniture, and clean the windows that offered million-dollar views to people who barely glanced at them. It was honest work that paid enough to keep a roof over his head and food on his table, though just barely. Tonight's poker game was running later than usual, which meant David's cleaning schedule was being pushed deeper into the early morning hours. He didn't mind the extra time; overtime pay was a rare luxury he couldn't afford to refuse, even if it meant listening to the casual cruelty that often accompanied gatherings of the wealthy and powerful. He had heard Victoria make similar games and bets before, watched her humiliate business rivals with the same cold amusement she displayed at the poker table. The game continued with Victoria's dominance becoming increasingly obvious. Her psychological warfare was as sharp as her business strategy, using carefully timed comments and calculated risks to unnerve her opponents. She had a way of making even the most successful people in the room feel small and inadequate, her success serving as a weapon she wielded with surgical precision. "You know what fascinates me about poker?" Victoria mused as she examined her latest hand, her green eyes reflecting the chandelier's light like polished emeralds. "It's not really about the cards you're dealt. It's about convincing everyone else that your hand is better than theirs, even when it's not. It's about power, control, and the ability to make grown men fold like origami." Her words carried weight beyond the poker table, and everyone in the room knew it. Victoria's reputation for destroying competitors was legendary in their circles. She had bankrupted rival companies with the same casual efficiency she displayed in tonight's game, using legal loopholes and financial pressure to crush anyone who dared compete with sterling enterprises. Marcus Webb cleared his throat nervously, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he reached for his whiskey glass. "Victoria, perhaps we should call it a night. The hour is getting rather late, and some of us have early morning meetings." Victoria's laugh was like breaking glass. "Running away so soon, Marcus? And here I thought oil executives were supposed to be tough. Your grandfather would be disappointed to see his empire being managed by someone who folds at the first sign of real competition." The insult hit its mark with devastating accuracy. Marcus's face flushed red, his jaw clenching as he struggled to maintain his composure. The other players exchanged uncomfortable glances, recognizing Victoria's tactical cruelty but powerless to intervene without becoming her next target. David continued his methodical cleaning, but his trained ear caught every nuance of the conversation. Years of working in corporate environments had taught him to read the subtleties of power dynamics, to understand the unspoken language of hierarchy and intimidation. He recognized Victoria's tactics because he had seen them employed countless times in boardrooms and executive offices throughout the building. As the night deepened, Victoria's chips continued to multiply while her opponent's stacks dwindled like morning mist before the sun. Her confidence grew with each victory, her comments becoming sharper and more personal. She seemed to feed off their discomfort, drawing energy from their mounting losses and wounded pride. "I have a proposition," Victoria announced suddenly, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. She leaned back in her leather chair, her emerald silk blouse catching the light as she surveyed the room with the satisfaction of a predator who had successfully cornered her prey. "This game has become rather predictable. Perhaps we need to raise the stakes beyond mere money." The room fell silent except for the quiet hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic far below on the city streets. Even David paused in his cleaning routine, though he kept his head down and continued to appear focused on his work. Something in Victoria's tone suggested that whatever she was about to propose would be more than just another high-stakes bet. Saracen set down her cards with deliberate care, her dark eyes wary as she studied Victoria's expression. "What kind of proposition are you talking about, Victoria? We're already playing for more money than most people see in a lifetime." Victoria's smile was sharp and calculating, the expression of someone who had just thought of a particularly entertaining way to demonstrate her superiority. "Money is just numbers on a screen, Sarah. I'm talking about something with real consequences, something that will make this evening memorable for all of us." She stood gracefully, her heels clicking against the marble floor as she moved to the windows that offered a panoramic view of the city she had conquered through sheer force of will and ruthless ambition. The lights below twinkled like stars, each one representing lives and dreams that existed far beneath her rarefied world of corporate power and unlimited wealth. "I propose we invite someone new to join our game," Victoria continued, her reflection in the window showing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Someone who couldn't possibly understand the complexities of high-stakes poker, someone who would provide us with genuine entertainment rather than this tedious professional courtesy we've been showing each other." Marcus Webb shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his expensive suit suddenly feeling too tight around his collar. "Victoria, what exactly are you suggesting? We can't just pull random people off the street to participate in a game of this magnitude. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story." Victoria turned from the window, her gaze sweeping across the room until it settled on David, who had been quietly organizing cleaning supplies in the corner. For the first time all evening, she seemed to truly see him as something more than living furniture, though her attention carried the same predatory quality she had shown toward her poker opponents. "We don't need to go to the street," she said softly, her voice carrying a dangerous undertone that made the other players tense with anticipation. "We have someone right here who could provide exactly the kind of entertainment I'm looking for." David felt the weight of her gaze like a physical presence, but he continued his work without acknowledgement, hoping that whatever game Victoria was planning would pass him by like a storm cloud moving across an otherwise clear sky. He had learned through hard experience that drawing attention from people like Victoria Sterling rarely ended well for someone in his position. "The janitor?" Sarah Chen's voice carried a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "Victoria, you can't be serious. This is a professional poker game with serious money involved. We can't just invite random employees to participate." But Victoria's smile grew wider, her green eyes glittering with the kind of manic excitement that preceded her most ruthless business moves. She had found her entertainment for the evening, and nothing was going to dissuade her from pursuing it to its logical conclusion. "Why not?" Victoria asked, her voice taking on the persuasive quality that had convinced investors to fund her wildest expansion projects. "Poker is supposed to be about reading people, about psychology, and bluffing. What could be more interesting than testing those skills against someone who has absolutely nothing to lose and everything to gain?" She walked slowly toward David, her heels clicking against the marble like a countdown timer. Each step seemed to echo in the suddenly silent room, the other players watching with the horrified fascination of observers witnessing a particularly spectacular accident about to unfold. "You there," Victoria called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. "What's your name?" David straightened slowly, setting down his cleaning supplies with deliberate care before turning to face the woman who held the power to make his life significantly more complicated with a single word to building management. His brown eyes met her green ones with quiet dignity, though he kept his expression carefully neutral. "David Rodriguez, ma'am," he replied, his voice steady despite the sudden attention from a room full of people who could collectively buy and sell small nations. "I apologize if my cleaning duties have disturbed your game. I can return later if you prefer." Victoria's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Oh, you haven't disturbed anything, David. In fact, I think you're exactly what this game needs to become truly interesting. Tell me, do you know how to play poker?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the abandoned cigars cooling in crystal ashtrays around the table. David felt the weight of multiple stares boring into him, each pair of eyes carrying different expectations and judgments. He knew that whatever answer he gave would determine whether he could simply return to his cleaning duties or find himself thrust into a situation far beyond his control. "I know the basic rules, ma'am," David replied carefully, his years of experience in corporate environments having taught him the value of diplomatic understatement. "But I'm sure you and your guests prefer to play without interruptions from the cleaning staff." Victoria's laugh was like champagne bubbles bursting, bright, effervescent, and carrying just a hint of something darker beneath the surface. "Nonsense, David. I think you would make an excellent addition to our little game. In fact, I have a proposition that might interest you." She moved closer, close enough that David could smell her expensive perfume and see the calculated gleam in her eyes that he recognized from his observations of her business meetings. This was Victoria Sterling in full predator mode, having identified what she perceived as easy prey and preparing to pounce with devastating effectiveness. "Here's what I propose," Victoria continued, her voice taking on the hypnotic quality of a skilled negotiator closing a deal. "One hand of poker. Just one. You against me, winner takes all. If you lose, you go back to your cleaning and we never speak of this again. But if you win..." She paused dramatically, letting the tension build as the other players leaned forward in their chairs despite themselves. Even Marcus Webb seemed to have forgotten his earlier desire to end the evening, drawn into Victoria's web of psychological manipulation like a moth to a particularly bright and dangerous flame. "If you win," Victoria said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper, "I'll marry you." The words hit the room like a physical blow, sucking the air from the space and leaving behind a silence so complete that David could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. The other players sat frozen, their expressions cycling through disbelief, shock, and horrified fascination as they processed what Victoria had just proposed. Saracen was the first to find her voice, though it came out as barely more than a strangled whisper. "Victoria, you can't be serious. This is insane, even for you." But Victoria's smile never wavered, her green eyes locked on David's face as she studied his reaction with the intensity of a scientist observing a particularly interesting specimen. "Why is it insane, Sarah? It's just a friendly wager between consenting adults. David here has nothing to lose and everything to gain. I, on the other hand, am risking my most precious possession, my freedom, on my absolute certainty that I understand the game of poker better than someone who pushes a mop for a living." Marcus Webb struggled to his feet, his face pale and his hands shaking slightly as he reached for his jacket. "This has gone too far, Victoria. I won't be party to whatever psychological game you're playing here. This man doesn't deserve to be humiliated for your entertainment." Victoria's expression hardened, her smile transforming into something cold and predatory. "Sit down, Marcus. Nobody is forcing anyone to do anything they don't want to do. I'm simply offering David an opportunity that most people in his position could only dream of, a chance to change his entire life with a single hand of cards." She turned back to David, her voice softening to a tone that might have been mistaken for genuine concern if not for the calculating gleam in her eyes. "What do you say, David? Are you brave enough to take a chance on changing your destiny, or are you content to spend the rest of your life cleaning up after your betters?" The insult was delivered with surgical precision, designed to wound pride and provoke a reaction. David felt the familiar burn of humiliation that he had experienced countless times throughout his life, the sting of being dismissed and diminished by people who measured worth solely in dollar signs and social status. But beneath the hurt, something else stirred, a memory of a different time, a different life, when his name had commanded respect and his skills had been recognized by people who understood the subtle complexities of reading opponents and calculating odds. It was a memory he had buried deep, covered over with years of disappointment and the grinding necessity of survival, but Victoria's challenge had awakened something that had been sleeping for far too long. The other players watched in fascination as David stood silently, his brown eyes distant as he weighed options that would have seemed impossible just moments before. They could see the internal struggle playing out across his weathered features, the battle between pride and practicality, between the safety of invisibility and the dangerous allure of being truly seen. Victoria waited with the patience of a master angler who had cast the perfect lure and now needed only to wait for her prey to take the bait. She could sense the shift in David's demeanor, the subtle change in his posture that suggested her psychological manipulation was having the desired effect. "I understand this is a big decision," Victoria continued, her voice taking on a sympathetic quality that was completely at odds with the predatory gleam in her eyes. "After all, it's not every day that someone in your position gets offered a chance to marry into one of the city's most powerful families. Think about what that would mean: financial security, social status, respect from people who have never bothered to learn your name." She gestured toward the luxurious conference room, the expensive artwork on the walls, the view of the city that stretched out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. "All of this could be yours, David. One hand of poker, and you could leave behind a life of manual labor and invisible service. You could become someone who matters in this world." David's hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, the internal battle becoming more visible as Victoria continued her psychological assault. He knew that this was exactly the kind of cruel game that people like Victoria played for entertainment, using their power and wealth to manipulate those they considered beneath them. He had seen it countless times during his years of invisible service, witnessed the casual cruelty that the wealthy inflicted on each other and on anyone unfortunate enough to attract their attention. But he also knew that Victoria was wrong about one crucial detail in her calculated manipulation. She assumed that he was nothing more than what he appeared to be on the surface, a simple janitor with no understanding of the complexities of high-stakes poker, someone who could be easily defeated and humiliated for the amusement of her wealthy friends. What Victoria Sterling didn't know, what none of them could have guessed from his faded uniform and invisible presence, was that David Rodriguez had once been one of the most feared poker players in underground games from Las Vegas to Atlantic City. Before life had stripped away his dreams and forced him into the shadows of survival, he had been known in certain circles as the Ghost, a player who could read tells and calculate odds with an almost supernatural accuracy. That life felt like a lifetime ago, buried beneath years of responsibility and the grinding reality of trying to make ends meet on a janitor's salary. He had walked away from the poker world not because he lacked the skill to compete, but because the stakes had become too high and the cost of playing had threatened to consume everything he held dear. Now Victoria Sterling, in her arrogance and cruel desire for entertainment, was offering him a chance to return to that world, not for money or fame, but for something far more dangerous. She was betting her own freedom on her assumption that she could easily defeat someone she saw as beneath her notice, someone whose true capabilities were hidden behind a maintenance uniform and years of careful invisibility. The irony was not lost on David. Victoria thought she was the predator in this scenario, using her wealth and position to manipulate someone she perceived as helpless prey. But what she had actually done was awaken something that had been dormant for far too long, stirring memories of a time when he had been the one calculating odds and reading opponents with deadly precision. The other players shifted nervously in their seats, sensing the change in the room's atmosphere without fully understanding its source. They could see that something had shifted in David's demeanor, a subtle transformation that made him seem less like invisible furniture and more like someone worth paying attention to. Sarachan leaned forward, her business instincts warning her that Victoria's game was about to become far more complicated than anyone at the table had anticipated. "David, you don't have to do this. Victoria is known for her psychological manipulation tactics. This isn't a fair proposition, and everyone in this room knows it." But Victoria's smile only grew wider, her confidence absolute in her ability to control the situation. "Fair? Sarah, life isn't fair. Business isn't fair. Poker certainly isn't fair. It's about who wants to win more, who's willing to risk more, and who has the skills to back up their ambition. I'm offering David the chance of a lifetime, and all he has to do is prove that he deserves it." She moved closer to David, close enough to study his face for any sign of weakness or doubt. "The question is, David, do you believe in yourself enough to take this chance? Do you have the courage to risk one hand of poker for the opportunity to change everything about your life?" David felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a physical force. Everyone in the room was watching him now, their earlier dismissal replaced by genuine curiosity about what the invisible janitor would do when faced with such an extraordinary proposition. He could walk away, return to his cleaning duties, and pretend this conversation had never happened. It would be the safe choice, the practical choice, the choice that would preserve the quiet anonymity that had protected him for so long. But something in Victoria's tone, in the casual cruelty of her assumption that he would be easy prey, sparked a fire that had been banked but never fully extinguished. She was betting that she could humiliate him in front of her wealthy friends, using him as entertainment while demonstrating her superior understanding of poker strategy and psychology. What she didn't realize was that she had just challenged someone who had once been considered one of the most dangerous players in underground poker circles, someone who had walked away from that world not because he lacked the skill to compete, but because he had chosen to prioritize other things over the dangerous allure of high-stakes gambling. David straightened his shoulders, feeling memories and instincts awakening that had been buried under years of invisible service and financial struggle. His brown eyes, which had seemed tired and defeated just moments before, now carried a spark of something that made even Victoria pause in her psychological manipulation. "One hand," David said quietly, his voice carrying a new quality that made everyone in the room lean forward to hear him better. "Winner takes all, as you said. But I need to understand the terms completely before I agree to anything." Victoria's smile was triumphant, her green eyes glittering with the satisfaction of someone who had successfully manipulated her target into exactly the position she wanted. "The terms are simple, David. One hand of Texas Hold'em poker. We each get dealt 2 cards, and we play with 5 community cards. Best hand wins. If you lose, you go back to your cleaning and we never speak of this again. If you win, which we both know won't happen, I honor my word and marry you." She gestured toward the poker table with its expensive felt surface and scattered chips from the evening's earlier games. "We'll use the same stakes that have been in play tonight. Winner takes the entire pot plus my commitment to marriage. That's over $200,000 in cash, plus the added value of becoming my husband with all the social and financial benefits that entails." David nodded slowly, his mind already calculating odds and probabilities with the automatic precision of someone who had once made his living reading cards and opponents. "And if I lose?" "If you lose, you disappear back into the invisibility you're so comfortable with," Victoria replied, her voice carrying a note of cruel amusement. "You return to your mop and your minimum wage job, and you live with the knowledge that you had a chance to change everything and weren't good enough to take it." The psychological warfare was subtle but devastating, designed to make David feel that his worth as a human being was being measured by this single hand of poker. Victoria was using every tool in her arsenal of manipulation, combining financial temptation with personal insult to create a situation where David would feel compelled to prove himself regardless of the odds against him. But what Victoria didn't understand was that David had been in similar situations many times before, facing opponents who tried to use psychological pressure and intimidation to gain an advantage at the poker table. He had learned long ago how to separate his emotional response from his strategic thinking, how to remain calm and focused even when the stakes were impossibly high. Marcus Webb made one final attempt to inject reason into the increasingly surreal situation. "This is madness, Victoria. You're talking about marriage as if it's a poker chip to be wagered. What happens if you actually lose? Do you really intend to honor such a ridiculous bet?" Victoria's expression hardened, her green eyes flashing with the kind of dangerous intensity that had made her one of the most feared business leaders in the city. "I don't lose, Marcus. I didn't build Sterling Enterprises by accepting defeat, and I certainly won't start now against someone whose biggest decision each day is which bathroom to clean first." The insult hung in the air like poison, designed to provoke David into making an emotional decision rather than a strategic one. But instead of anger or hurt, Victoria's words seemed to have awakened something calm and calculating in David's demeanor, a transformation so subtle that only the most observant watchers would have noticed it. David walked slowly to the poker table, his movements now carrying a different quality than they had when he was performing his cleaning duties. There was a purposefulness to his steps, a quiet confidence that suggested he was moving into familiar territory rather than stumbling into unknown danger. "I accept your proposition," David said quietly, his voice steady and calm as he pulled out one of the leather chairs that had been occupied by the evening's earlier players. "One hand of Texas Hold'em, winner takes all." Victoria's smile was sharp and predatory as she took her seat across from him, her manicured hands already reaching for the deck of cards that had been used throughout the evening's games. "Excellent choice, David. I do hope you won't be too disappointed when reality crashes down around your brief moment of delusion." The other players arranged themselves around the table like spectators at a gladiatorial match, their earlier discomfort replaced by morbid fascination with what was about to unfold. Sarachan kept shaking her head in disbelief, while Marcus Webb loosened his tie completely and reached for another whiskey, clearly needing fortification for whatever psychological carnage was about to be unleashed. Victoria shuffled the cards with practiced ease, her movements fluid and confident as she prepared to demonstrate her superiority over someone she viewed as completely outmatched. "Since this is your first time playing in such elevated company, David, shall I explain the rules of Texas Hold'em? I wouldn't want you to be confused about how thoroughly you're about to be defeated." But David simply shook his head, settling into his chair with the kind of comfortable familiarity that suggested he had spent considerable time at poker tables before. "I understand the rules, thank you. Deal the cards whenever you're ready." Something in his tone made Victoria pause, a subtle shift in his demeanor that registered in her subconscious even though her conscious mind remained focused on her anticipated victory. For just a moment, she found herself wondering if there might be more to David Rodriguez than met the eye, but the thought was quickly dismissed by her absolute confidence in her own abilities. The cards were dealt with crisp efficiency, 2 face down to each player. Victoria picked up her cards with practiced casualness, her expression revealing nothing as she examined what fate had delivered to her hand. Across the table, David's movements were equally controlled as he lifted his cards, his weathered fingers handling them with a familiarity that might have warned a more observant opponent. The first 3 community cards were dealt face-up in the center of the table, the flop that would begin to reveal the true strength of each player's hand. Victoria studied the cards with the calculating intensity of someone who had built an empire on her ability to assess risks and opportunities, while David's expression remained completely neutral, giving away nothing about the strength of his position. As the hand progressed through its various stages, something began to shift in the atmosphere around the poker table. The other players, who had expected to witness a quick and brutal demonstration of Victoria's superiority, found themselves watching something far more complex and intriguing unfold before them. David's play was not that of an amateur stumbling through unfamiliar territory. His betting patterns showed a sophisticated understanding of poker strategy, his timing was impeccable, and his ability to maintain an unreadable expression suggested years of experience at high-stakes tables. Most tellingly, he seemed completely unaffected by Victoria's attempts at psychological manipulation, treating her verbal jabs and intimidation tactics with the calm indifference of someone who had faced far more dangerous opponents. Victoria, for her part, began to experience something she had rarely encountered in either business or poker, genuine uncertainty about the outcome of a confrontation she had initiated. David's play was forcing her to reassess her assumptions about his capabilities, and the comfortable superiority she had felt just minutes before was beginning to give way to something approaching respect for his skills. The final community cards were dealt, completing the 5-card tableau that would determine the winner of this unprecedented wager. Both players studied their complete hands with the intensity of generals planning decisive battles, calculating odds, and assessing the strength of their positions with years of accumulated experience. The moment of truth had arrived, and everyone in the room could sense that they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple poker game between mismatched opponents. The invisible janitor and the powerful CEO were locked in a battle of wills and skills that would determine not just the outcome of a bizarre bet, but the very nature of how they saw themselves and each other. Victoria's confident smile had faded into a mask of concentration as she realized that David Rodriguez was not the easy prey she had expected him to be. Whatever was about to happen, it would not be the simple demonstration of superiority she had planned when she first noticed the man with the mop standing quietly in the corner of her exclusive poker game. The silence stretched across the conference room like a taut wire ready to snap. Victoria Sterling's manicured fingers drummed against the felt surface of the poker table, her emerald eyes studying David Rodriguez with an intensity that would have made most people squirm uncomfortably in their seats. But David sat motionless, his weathered hands resting calmly on his cards, his expression as unreadable as granite carved by decades of wind and rain. What Victoria didn't know, what none of the wealthy spectators gathered around the table could have guessed, was that the man sitting across from her had learned to master his emotions at poker tables where a single tell could mean the difference between walking away with a fortune or leaving in a body bag. The underground gambling circuit that had once been David's world operated by rules far more dangerous than anything these corporate titans could imagine, where psychological warfare was backed by physical threats and losing the wrong hand could cost more than money. David's mind drifted back through the years as he waited for Victoria to make her next move, memories surfacing like bubbles rising through dark water. He had been 23 when he first discovered his gift for reading people, sitting in a backroom poker game in East Los Angeles where the stakes were measured not just in dollars but in respect, territory, and sometimes life itself. The other players had been older, harder men who had earned their places at that table through years of surviving in a world where weakness was a luxury no one could afford. His father, Miguel Rodriguez, had been a construction worker who spent his days building the foundations for other people's dreams while struggling to keep his own family afloat. Miguel had possessed hands that could shape concrete and steel with artisan precision, but he had never learned to navigate the complex social hierarchies that determined who succeeded and who remained invisible in American society. He had worked himself to death by 52, his body worn down by decades of physical labor and the stress of never quite earning enough to provide the security his family deserved. David's mother, Elena, had cleaned houses for wealthy families in Beverly Hills, her days spent maintaining the pristine environments where privilege flourished while her own children grew up in a cramped apartment where the American dream felt more like a cruel joke than an achievable goal. She had taught David and his younger sister Sophia the importance of dignity and honest work, but she had also understood that sometimes dignity wasn't enough to change the fundamental inequalities that shaped their world. It was Elena who had first noticed David's unusual ability to read people's intentions and emotions, watching him navigate playground politics with an intuitive understanding of human nature that seemed far beyond his years. She had seen him diffuse conflicts between neighborhood kids by somehow knowing exactly what to say and when to say it, his young mind already calculating the complex social dynamics that governed human interaction. When David turned 18 and graduation approached with no clear path to college or career advancement, Elena had made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She had introduced her son to her brother Carlos, a man who had found his own way out of poverty through means that existed in the gray areas between legal and illegal, legitimate and dangerous. Carlos Rodriguez operated several small businesses throughout Los Angeles, from auto repair shops to corner markets, but his real income came from facilitating the underground economy that thrived in communities where traditional financial institutions offered little support for ambitious dreams. He ran poker games for working-class men who needed excitement and the possibility of quick money to make their daily struggles bearable, and he had recognized David's potential the moment his nephew sat down at one of those tables. Under Carlos's guidance, David had learned that poker was far more than a card game. It was a complex psychological battlefield where success depended on reading micro-expressions, understanding betting patterns, managing risk, and most importantly, maintaining absolute control over your own emotional responses. Carlos had taught him that every player brought their entire life history to the table, their fears and hopes and desperation creating tells that could be read by anyone patient and observant enough to look for them. David's natural gift for reading people had made him a formidable player almost immediately, but it was his discipline and emotional control that had elevated him from merely good to genuinely dangerous. While other young players let their egos drive their decisions or allowed winning streaks to make them reckless, David had learned to treat every hand as an independent mathematical problem to be solved through careful analysis and strategic thinking. By the time he turned 25, David had earned enough from underground poker games to move his mother out of their cramped apartment and into a small house in a better neighborhood. He had put his sister through college and established a legitimate business that served as a front for his real income source. To the outside world, he was a successful small business owner who had worked his way up from poverty through determination and smart decisions. But the underground poker world operated according to rules that extended far beyond the card table, and David had slowly begun to understand that his success was drawing attention from people who viewed talented players as either assets to be controlled or threats to be eliminated. The games were getting bigger, the stakes higher, and the players more dangerous. What had started as a way to escape poverty was becoming a trap that threatened to destroy everything he had worked to build. The turning point had come during a high-stakes game in a warehouse in Long Beach, where David had found himself playing against men whose wealth came from activities that made underground poker look like a church social. The pot had grown to over $500,000, and David had been holding a hand strong enough to win everything on the table. But as he had studied his opponents, reading their tells and calculating their likely holdings, he had realized that winning this particular game might cost him far more than losing ever could. The man sitting directly across from him had been Antonio Vega, a figure whose reputation in certain circles was built on his willingness to eliminate problems with permanent solutions. Vega had been losing heavily throughout the evening, and David had recognized the dangerous combination of desperation and pride that was building behind the man's carefully controlled exterior. Winning that pot would have meant taking money that Vega couldn't afford to lose, money that belonged to people who settled debts with methods that had nothing to do with bankruptcy courts or payment plans. David had made a decision that night that had probably saved his life but had also marked the beginning of the end of his career as a professional poker player. He had folded a winning hand, walking away from enough money to set him up for life because he had understood that some victories came with prices too high to pay. Vega had won the pot and had nodded at David across the table with an expression that suggested he understood exactly what had just happened and why. But word of David's fold had spread through the underground gambling community with the speed of wildfire, and the interpretation had not been kind to his reputation. Some had seen it as wisdom, the mark of a player smart enough to know when to walk away. Others had viewed it as weakness, evidence that David Rodriguez could be pressured into making decisions based on fear rather than cards. Either way, his effectiveness as a player had been compromised, and the invitations to the most lucrative games had gradually stopped coming. Around the same time, David had met Carmen Delgado, a social worker who had been trying to help kids in his neighborhood find alternatives to the street life that claimed so many young people before they had a chance to discover their potential. Carmen had possessed a combination of idealism and practical wisdom that had challenged David to think about what he really wanted from life beyond the next big score or the adrenaline rush of high-stakes gambling. Their courtship had been complicated by David's need to keep his real source of income secret, but Carmen had possessed an intuitive understanding of people that had made her suspicious of his cover story about legitimate business success. She had never asked directly about the source of his money, but she had made it clear that she was building a life with someone she hoped was building something more sustainable than quick scores and dangerous associations. When Carmen had become pregnant with their daughter Isabella, David had made the most difficult decision of his life. He had walked away from the underground poker world completely, liquidating his assets and using the money to start a legitimate construction business that built on the skills his father had taught him and the business acumen he had developed through years of managing risk and reading people. The transition had been brutal. Going from making thousands of dollars in a single evening to earning a construction worker's wages had required adjustments that went far beyond financial. David had been accustomed to the respect and fear that came with being known as one of the most dangerous players in underground gambling circles. Becoming just another small business owner struggling to compete for contracts had been a humbling experience that had tested his commitment to building a different kind of life. But Isabella's birth had validated every sacrifice he had made. Holding his daughter for the first time, seeing Carmen's exhausted but radiant smile as she cradled their child, David had known that he had made the right choice. This was what mattered, not the adrenaline rush of high-stakes gambling or the respect of men whose approval came with deadly strings attached. This was worth protecting, worth building a legitimate life around. For several years, David's construction business had thrived. His ability to read people served him well in negotiations with clients and suppliers, and his disciplined approach to risk management had helped him navigate the economic challenges that destroyed many small businesses. Carmen had established a successful social work practice, and their family had seemed to be living proof that it was possible to build something good and lasting through honest work and careful choices. But life had a way of testing even the most carefully constructed plans. Isabella had been diagnosed with a rare genetic condition when she was 6 years old, a progressive disorder that required specialized medical care far beyond what their insurance would cover. The treatments were experimental and expensive, available only at research hospitals that charged fees that would have challenged even wealthy families. David had exhausted their savings, mortgaged their house, and borrowed against his business to pay for Isabella's care. Carmen had taken a second job while continuing to care for their daughter, and both parents had pushed themselves to the breaking point trying to provide everything their child needed. The construction business had suffered as David's attention was divided between work and family crisis, and several major contracts had gone to competitors who could guarantee their full focus. When Isabella had died at age 8, despite all the money and effort and desperate hope that had been poured into trying to save her, David and Carmen's marriage had not survived the combination of grief and financial ruin that followed. They had blamed themselves and each other for decisions made under impossible pressure, and the love that had once seemed strong enough to overcome any obstacle had crumbled under the weight of loss and recrimination. Carmen had moved back east to be closer to her family, taking a job with a non-profit organization that worked with children facing medical crises. David had understood her need to find meaning in their tragedy by helping other families navigate similar challenges, but her departure had left him alone with debt, grief, and a construction business that was failing due to his inability to focus on anything beyond his daughter's empty bedroom. The bankruptcy had been inevitable. David had lost the house, the business, and most of the material evidence of the legitimate life he had tried to build. At 38, he had found himself starting over with nothing but the skills he had learned at poker tables and construction sites, trying to figure out how to rebuild from a foundation that felt completely shattered. He had considered returning to underground gambling, using his poker skills to quickly generate the money he needed to get back on his feet. The contacts were still there, and his reputation, while complicated by his strategic fold years earlier, would still have opened doors to high-stakes games. But every time he had considered picking up cards in anger, David had remembered Isabella's laugh and Carmen's warning about the kind of life she wanted their daughter to grow up around. Instead, he had taken the janitor position at Grandview Corporate Center, accepting work that paid barely enough to cover rent and basic expenses, but that came with the anonymity he needed to figure out what came next. The job required no explanations about his past, no references from business associates who might have uncomfortable questions about his previous sources of income. He could show up, do the work, collect his paycheck, and remain invisible while he processed his grief and tried to figure out how to build a life worth living from the ruins of everything he had lost. For years of emptying trash cans and mopping floors had given David plenty of time to observe the wealthy and powerful people who populated the executive floors of Grandview Corporate Center. He had listened to their conversations about deals worth millions of dollars while they remained completely unaware of his presence, had watched them navigate complex social hierarchies and business relationships with the same calculating intensity he had once brought to poker tables. What had struck him most about these observations was how similar the executive world was to the underground gambling circuits he had once navigated. The same skills that had made him successful at poker, reading people's intentions, understanding power dynamics, managing risk, controlling emotional responses, were exactly the tools that determined success in corporate environments. The stakes were different and the consequences were usually financial rather than physical, but the fundamental psychological dynamics were remarkably similar. Victoria Sterling represented everything David had observed about corporate power during his years of invisible service. She possessed the absolute confidence that came from never having experienced real consequences for her actions, the casual cruelty that often accompanied inherited privilege, and the assumption that anyone she perceived as beneath her social status could be manipulated or dismissed without consideration for their humanity or capabilities. What she didn't understand was that she had just challenged someone who had learned to read people in environments where making mistakes about human nature could have fatal consequences. David's years of underground poker had taught him to see beyond surface appearances and social positioning to the underlying psychological patterns that determined how people behaved under pressure. And what he was seeing in Victoria Sterling's confident smirk and calculating green eyes was exactly the kind of overconfidence that had destroyed better players than her in games with much higher stakes than marriage or money. The community cards lay spread across the felt surface like a roadmap to destiny, and David could feel the familiar calm settling over him that had always preceded his best performances at high-stakes tables. This was the mental state he had learned to cultivate through years of dangerous games, where emotional reactions were luxuries that could cost everything and clear thinking was the only path to survival. Victoria was studying her cards with the same intensity she brought to corporate acquisitions, her mind no doubt calculating odds and considering strategic options with the mathematical precision that had built her empire. But David could see something in her posture and micro-expressions that she was probably unaware of herself, the subtle signs of someone who had never faced a challenge that required her to question her fundamental assumptions about her own superiority. The other players around the table had fallen silent, their earlier conversation replaced by the tension of spectators watching something unprecedented unfold before them. Marcus Webb had loosened his tie completely and was gripping his whiskey glass with white knuckles, while Sarah Chen leaned forward in her chair with the focused attention of someone trying to understand a complex business negotiation with implications far beyond the immediate participants. David's mind was running probability calculations with the automatic precision developed through thousands of hours at poker tables, but he was also reading Victoria's tells with the deeper insight that came from understanding how people revealed their true selves under pressure. She was good, probably better than most of the corporate executives and wealthy amateurs who populated the exclusive games she usually played in. But she had made the crucial mistake of underestimating her opponent based on surface appearances and social prejudices. The underground poker world that had shaped David's understanding of human nature operated according to principles that corporate titans like Victoria rarely encountered in their carefully protected environments. In those games, respect had to be earned through demonstrated skill rather than inherited through social position, and the most dangerous opponents were often the ones who looked least threatening on the surface. David had learned to never dismiss anyone based on their appearance or apparent social status, because survival in that world depended on accurately assessing everyone's true capabilities regardless of how they presented themselves to the world. Victoria's betting pattern was revealing information about her hand that she probably didn't realize she was broadcasting. Her confidence was genuine, which suggested she was holding strong cards, but there was also a subtle tension in her shoulders that indicated she was not as certain of victory as her verbal taunts suggested. She was playing the role of the predator stalking easy prey, but David could see the calculation behind her performance, the careful consideration of someone who understood that appearances and psychological manipulation were crucial elements of poker strategy. The fact that Victoria was working so hard to project dominance actually told David more about her mental state than if she had simply played her cards without commentary. Truly confident players rarely felt the need to verbally intimidate their opponents, because they trusted their skills to speak for themselves. The constant stream of insulting observations and threats suggested that Victoria was trying to convince herself as much as David that she was in complete control of the situation. David had faced this kind of psychological warfare many times before, usually from opponents who had mistaken his quiet demeanor for weakness or his working-class background for lack of sophistication. He had learned that the best response to such tactics was simply to remain focused on the mathematics and psychology of the game itself, treating verbal attacks as irrelevant noise that had no bearing on the actual strength of his hand or the strategic decisions he needed to make. The final betting round approached, and David could feel the familiar clarity that came when all the variables aligned and the correct path forward became obvious. This was the moment he had always lived for during his poker career, when years of study and practice crystallized into intuitive understanding that transcended conscious thought. He knew with absolute certainty what Victoria was holding, understood exactly how she would respond to different betting scenarios, and could see several moves ahead to the inevitable conclusion of their confrontation. What made this hand different from the thousands of others he had played during his underground career was not the stakes or the complexity of the strategic situation, but the recognition that this moment represented something more than just another poker game. Victoria Sterling had chosen to use him as entertainment for her wealthy friends, assuming that his social position made him fair game for public humiliation. She had offered him marriage as if it were a prize rather than a partnership, reducing the most intimate human relationship to a commodity to be won or lost based on card-playing ability. The irony was that Victoria's cruel game had awakened something in David that had been dormant for years, reminding him that he possessed skills and knowledge that commanded respect in the only arena where those qualities truly mattered. For the first time since Isabella's death, he felt fully present and engaged with the world around him, his mind working with the clarity and precision that had once made him one of the most feared players in underground gambling circles. David could see the moment when Victoria realized that her psychological warfare was having no effect on her opponent. Her confident smile faltered slightly as she studied his impassive expression, searching for the signs of intimidation or nervousness that should have been obvious in someone facing his first high-stakes poker confrontation. Instead, she was seeing the calm focus of someone who had faced far more dangerous opponents than a corporate executive playing with inherited money. The silence in the room had taken on a different quality as the other spectators began to understand that they were witnessing something more complex than the simple humiliation Victoria had planned. Even Marcus Webb, who had been trying to leave since the beginning of this confrontation, was now leaning forward with the fascination of someone watching a master class in psychological combat unfold before his eyes. Saracen was perhaps the most perceptive observer at the table, her business experience having taught her to recognize when initial assumptions needed to be revised based on new information. She could see that David Rodriguez was not responding to this situation like someone overwhelmed by unfamiliar circumstances, and Victoria Sterling was not displaying the absolute confidence that should have accompanied her obvious advantages in wealth, education, and social position. The community cards told a story that both players could read, but the interpretation of that story depended on information that only they possessed about their own whole cards. David knew that Victoria was holding strong cards based on her betting pattern and body language, but he also knew that she was making assumptions about his likely holdings that were influenced more by her social prejudices than by careful observation of his actual play. Victoria's biggest mistake was not recognizing that David's calm demeanor and strategic patience were the marks of someone with extensive poker experience rather than signs of confusion or intimidation. She was reading his behavior through the lens of her preconceptions about what a janitor should know about high-stakes gambling, missing the subtle indicators that would have warned a more experienced player that this opponent was far more dangerous than he appeared. The betting reached its climax as both players committed to their final strategic positions. Victoria's last raise carried all the confidence of someone who believed she held the winning hand, her green eyes glittering with anticipation of the moment when she would reveal her cards and demonstrate her superiority to everyone watching. She was already composing the verbal victory speech she would deliver, the carefully crafted humiliation that would put David Rodriguez back in his proper place and provide her friends with an entertaining story to share at future social gatherings. But David's response to her final bet was not the fold or desperate call that Victoria expected from an outmatched amateur. Instead, his counter-raise was precisely calculated to put maximum pressure on Victoria's position while revealing nothing about the true strength of his own hand. The move demonstrated a level of strategic sophistication that made several of the spectators sit up with sudden attention, recognizing poker tactics that required years of experience to execute with such subtle effectiveness. Victoria's confident expression wavered for the first time as she processed David's unexpected aggression. Her mathematical mind was running calculations about pot odds and implied betting, but her assumptions about her opponent's capabilities were making it difficult for her to accurately assess the situation. She had expected to be playing against someone whose strategic thinking was limited by inexperience and social conditioning, not someone who was demonstrating advanced understanding of poker theory and psychological manipulation. The moment of truth arrived as both players revealed their cards, and the room erupted in gasps and exclamations as the reality of the situation became clear to everyone watching. David Rodriguez, the invisible janitor who cleaned their offices and emptied their trash cans, had not only matched Victoria Sterling's poker skills but had outplayed her with a combination of strategic brilliance and psychological insight that would have been impressive in any professional gaming environment. Victoria stared at the cards in stunned silence, her mind struggling to process how someone she had dismissed as insignificant could have read her so accurately and responded with such devastating effectiveness. The marriage bet that had seemed like a cruel joke just minutes earlier had suddenly become a binding obligation, and the corporate executive who had built her reputation on never making mistakes was facing the consequences of having underestimated an opponent based on nothing more than social prejudice and assumptions about class and capability. The other players around the table were experiencing their own moments of revelation as they watched David collect the chips with the same calm efficiency he brought to his cleaning duties. Marcus Webb was shaking his head in amazement, while Saracen was studying David with new respect and curiosity about what other assumptions she might need to reconsider about the people she encountered in her daily life. But perhaps the most significant transformation was happening in David himself, as he felt the familiar satisfaction of a perfectly played hand combining with something deeper and more meaningful than mere victory at a poker table. For the first time since Isabella's death, he had engaged fully with the world around him, using skills he had thought were buried forever to achieve something that transcended the immediate circumstances of the game. Victoria Sterling had intended to use him as entertainment for her wealthy friends, reducing him to a prop in her demonstration of social and intellectual superiority. Instead, she had awakened capabilities that she could never have imagined, forcing both herself and everyone else in the room to confront their assumptions about worth, dignity, and the hidden potential that existed in people they had trained themselves not to see. The quiet janitor had become visible in a way that would change how everyone present thought about the invisible workers who maintained their comfortable worlds, and the corporate executive who had built her identity on never losing had discovered that her understanding of human nature and strategic thinking had dangerous blind spots that could be exploited by anyone patient and skilled enough to look for them. As the immediate shock of the hand's conclusion settled over the room, both David and Victoria were beginning to understand that the real game was just beginning. The poker had been merely the opening move in a more complex confrontation that would test everything they thought they knew about themselves, each other, and the world they both inhabited but experienced in completely different ways. The silence that followed the revelation of the cards was profound and absolute, stretching across the conference room like a chasm that separated the world as it had existed moments before from the new reality that was now taking shape. Victoria Sterling sat frozen in her leather chair, her emerald eyes fixed on the community cards and David's winning hand with an expression of disbelief so complete that it seemed to have temporarily short-circuited her capacity for rational thought. The full house that David had revealed was mathematically beautiful in its devastating effectiveness, each card combining with the others to create an unbeatable combination that had been hidden behind his impassive expression throughout the entire hand. Victoria's own hand, which had seemed so strong just moments earlier, now lay exposed as merely very good rather than invincible, a painful reminder that in poker, as in life, confidence without complete information could lead to catastrophic miscalculations. Marcus Webb was the first to break the silence, his voice barely above a whisper as he attempted to process what he had just witnessed. "My God, Victoria. He actually did it. The janitor actually beat you." The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished flame, carrying implications that reached far beyond the immediate outcome of a single poker hand. Sarah Chen leaned back in her chair, her business-trained mind already working through the ramifications of what had just occurred and the assumptions that would need to be completely reassessed in light of David Rodriguez's unexpected demonstration of expertise. David himself remained seated calmly at the poker table, his weathered hands resting quietly on the felt surface as he observed the reactions of the people around him. There was no gloating in his expression, no triumphant celebration of his victory over someone who had attempted to humiliate him in front of her wealthy friends. Instead, there was simply the quiet satisfaction of someone who had performed a task with professional competence, the same calm demeanor he brought to his cleaning duties each night. Victoria's mind was racing through possibilities and explanations, searching for some rational framework that could accommodate what had just happened without requiring her to completely abandon her understanding of social hierarchies and human capabilities. The David Rodriguez she thought she knew, the invisible janitor who emptied her trash and cleaned her windows, could not possibly possess the sophisticated poker skills necessary to outplay her in a high-stakes confrontation. But the evidence was right there on the table, impossible to dismiss or explain away through comfortable assumptions about class and education. David had not simply gotten lucky with favorable cards, he had played the entire hand with strategic brilliance, reading her tells, managing his betting patterns, and maintaining psychological control under pressure with the expertise of someone who had clearly spent considerable time at serious poker tables. The realization that she had been completely wrong about David's capabilities was forcing Victoria to confront uncomfortable questions about her own perceptual blind spots and the reliability of her judgment about people. If she could be so thoroughly mistaken about someone she had observed for years, what other assumptions about human nature and social dynamics might be equally flawed? The marriage bet that had seemed like such a clever psychological weapon just minutes earlier was now revealed as a binding obligation that would change the trajectory of her carefully planned life. Victoria Sterling, who had built her empire on never making commitments she couldn't control and never accepting deals that didn't favor her interests, was now bound by her own words to marry someone she had intended to humiliate for the entertainment of her friends. The other players around the table were experiencing their own moments of cognitive dissonance as they tried to reconcile their previous dismissal of David as irrelevant with the undeniable evidence of his poker mastery. These were successful people accustomed to making accurate assessments of human potential and capability, yet they had all completely misjudged someone who worked among them every day. David finally spoke, his voice carrying the same steady calm that had characterized his play throughout the entire confrontation. The bet was one hand of poker, winner takes all. I believe the terms were clearly established and witnessed by everyone present. His words were not a challenge or a taunt, simply a factual statement about contractual obligations that had been freely entered into by both parties. There was something almost judicial in his tone, the calm authority of someone stating legal facts rather than gloating over a personal victory. Victoria's eyes flashed with something between anger and desperation as the full implications of her situation began to sink in. You can't seriously expect me to honor such a ridiculous wager. This was supposed to be entertainment, not a binding legal contract. But even as she spoke the words, Victoria knew they rang hollow in the face of the witnesses who had observed her making the bet with complete confidence in her ability to win. Her reputation in business circles was built on her word being absolutely reliable, and attempting to renege on a publicly witnessed agreement would damage her credibility in ways that could affect every future negotiation and deal. David's response was delivered with the patient tone of someone explaining obvious facts to a child. "You made the bet of your own free will, with multiple witnesses present. I didn't seek out this confrontation, Mrs. Sterling. You initiated it, established the terms, and insisted on proceeding despite several opportunities to reconsider." The formal use of her married title was a subtle reminder that Victoria's identity was already complicated by business decisions that had prioritized corporate success over personal relationships. Her brief marriage to a fellow executive had ended in divorce when it became clear that two people accustomed to absolute control couldn't share decision-making authority in their personal lives any more than they could in their professional environments. Sarah Chen, who had been listening to the exchange with growing fascination, finally spoke up with the directness that had made her successful in the technology sector. "David, forgive me for asking, but where did you learn to play poker like that? That wasn't beginner's luck or casual weekend games with friends. You demonstrated professional-level skills that require years of serious study and practice." David turned his attention to Sarah with the same calm focus he had maintained throughout the poker confrontation. "I've played the game before, Miss Chen. Sometimes circumstances require people to develop skills they wouldn't normally need in their chosen careers." The diplomatic non-answer revealed nothing while acknowledging everything, a response that suggested David Rodriguez was far more complex than anyone in the room had previously imagined. His ability to deflect personal questions while remaining completely truthful indicated a level of social sophistication that contradicted every assumption they had made about his background and capabilities. Marcus Webb, who had been nursing his whiskey throughout the evening's increasingly surreal events, finally found his voice. "This is insane. Victoria, you can't possibly be considering actually going through with this marriage bet. There has to be some way to resolve this situation that doesn't involve anyone's life being completely turned upside down." But Victoria's legal and business training was already working through the implications of attempting to break a publicly witnessed agreement. Her reputation for reliability was one of her most valuable business assets, and her ability to make binding commitments was essential to every contract negotiation and partnership discussion she entered into. If word spread through their exclusive social circles that Victoria Sterling couldn't be trusted to honor her own bets, the damage to her business relationships could be catastrophic. David waited patiently as the others discussed his future as if he were not present, his expression revealing nothing about his own thoughts regarding the marriage proposition that had started as a cruel joke and was now becoming a legal reality. He understood that people like Victoria Sterling viewed the world primarily in terms of how circumstances affected their own interests, and it would never occur to them to consider what he might want from this situation. The truth was that David had no interest in marrying Victoria Sterling or anyone else. The wounds from his failed marriage to Carmen were still too fresh, and his grief over Isabella's death had left him emotionally unavailable for the kind of intimate partnership that marriage required. But he also understood that Victoria's attempt to humiliate him had created a situation where backing down would be interpreted as weakness, both by her and by everyone else who witnessed their confrontation. More importantly, David recognized that this moment represented something larger than just the outcome of a poker game or the consequences of a foolish bet. Victoria Sterling embodied everything he had observed about corporate power during his years of invisible service, the casual cruelty and automatic assumption of superiority that allowed wealthy people to treat others as entertainment rather than human beings deserving of basic dignity and respect. By defeating her at poker, David had not simply won a game, he had challenged the fundamental assumptions about worth and capability that governed their respective positions in society. Victoria's shocked reaction and desperate attempts to avoid honoring her bet were revealing the fragility of her confidence when it was stripped of its usual protections of wealth and social position. Victoria's mind was working frantically through potential escape routes from the commitment she had made so confidently just an hour earlier. "There has to be some reasonable compromise we can reach. I'm willing to compensate you financially for your time and the inconvenience of this situation. Surely a monetary settlement would be more practical than forcing two people who barely know each other into a marriage neither of them truly wants." David's response was immediate and definitive. "The bet was not about money, Mrs. Sterling. You offered marriage, not financial compensation. If you had wanted to wager cash, you could have put money on the table like any other poker player." His refusal to accept a buyout was not motivated by any actual desire to marry Victoria, but by recognition that allowing her to escape the consequences of her actions through financial manipulation would validate everything he despised about how wealthy people used their resources to avoid accountability. Victoria had created this situation as a demonstration of her power over someone she perceived as helpless, and accepting money to let her off the hook would effectively confirm her assumption that everyone had a price and could be bought if the offer was high enough. Saracen was studying the dynamic between David and Victoria with the analytical intensity she brought to complex business problems, recognizing patterns and motivations that went far beyond the surface circumstances of their poker confrontation. "David, I have to ask, what is it that you actually want from this situation? Victoria is right that forcing two strangers into marriage seems like it would be unpleasant for everyone involved." David considered Sarah's question with the same careful thought he had given to his poker strategy, understanding that his answer would reveal important information about his character and motivations to people who were still trying to understand who he really was beneath his maintenance worker facade. "What I want, Miss Chen, is for people to understand that making bets with other people's dignity and self-worth has consequences," David replied, his voice carrying a quiet intensity that made everyone in the room pay closer attention. "Mrs. Sterling didn't invite me to this poker game because she thought I might enjoy the entertainment. She created this situation because she thought it would be amusing to humiliate someone she considered inferior in front of her wealthy friends." The accusation hung in the air with the weight of absolute truth, forcing everyone present to confront the real motivations that had led to their current circumstances. Victoria's face flushed with anger and embarrassment as her cruel intentions were exposed with clinical precision, but she couldn't deny the accuracy of David's assessment without lying to herself as much as to others. "You're making this sound much more sinister than it actually was," Victoria protested, though her voice lacked conviction. "It was just a game, a moment of spontaneous entertainment during what had been a rather boring evening." David's smile was sad rather than triumphant as he responded to her attempts at minimization. "It was only a game for you, Mrs. Sterling. For me, it was another reminder that people in your position view people in mine as objects to be used for your amusement rather than human beings deserving of basic respect." The quiet dignity in David's words created a moment of uncomfortable reflection for everyone present, forcing them to examine their own attitudes toward the invisible workers who maintained their comfortable worlds. How many times had they made casual comments or cruel jokes about service workers without considering that these were real people with complex lives, dreams, and capabilities that extended far beyond their job descriptions? Marcus Webb shifted uncomfortably in his chair, memories surfacing of his own dismissive treatment of employees and service workers throughout his career. Saracen was reconsidering conversations she had overheard in corporate environments, recognizing patterns of casual dehumanization that she had previously accepted as normal social dynamics among successful people. Victoria's anger was beginning to override her shock as she processed the implications of David's moral challenge to her behavior and worldview. "Don't you dare lecture me about respect and human dignity. I built my empire through hard work and smart decisions, not by playing victim and demanding special treatment because of my social background." David's response was delivered with the patient tone of someone explaining obvious facts to a willfully obtuse student. "I'm not asking for special treatment, Mrs. Sterling. I'm asking for the same basic consideration you would extend to anyone else whose life you decided to use as entertainment. The fact that you see treating me with ordinary human decency as special treatment reveals exactly the problem I'm talking about." The philosophical and moral dimensions of their confrontation were becoming more significant than the immediate practical questions about marriage and legal obligations. David was forcing Victoria to confront the ethical implications of how she treated people she considered beneath her social status, while she was struggling to defend behavior that looked increasingly indefensible when examined under the harsh light of moral scrutiny. The marriage bet that had started as a demonstration of social power was evolving into something much more complex, a test of character and values that would define both participants for years to come regardless of how the immediate situation was resolved. Victoria could attempt to buy her way out of the commitment through financial compensation, but doing so would confirm everything David believed about wealthy people using money to avoid consequences for their actions. Alternatively, she could honor her bet and marry someone she barely knew, accepting the profound disruption to her carefully controlled life as the price for her cruel entertainment. Either choice would require her to confront uncomfortable truths about herself and the moral compromises she had made in pursuit of wealth and power. David understood that he held all the leverage in their current situation, but he also recognized that how he chose to use that advantage would determine what kind of person he revealed himself to be when faced with the opportunity for revenge against someone who had attempted to humiliate him. The easy path would be to force Victoria into an unwanted marriage as punishment for her cruelty, satisfying his desire for justice while demonstrating that actions have consequences regardless of social position. But David's years of grief and reflection had taught him that revenge rarely provided the satisfaction people expected from it, and that causing others to suffer, even those who deserved punishment, often created more problems than it solved. Isabella's death had shown him the difference between outcomes that felt good in the moment and choices that led to genuine peace and healing over time. The real question was not whether Victoria would honor her bet, but what kind of resolution would serve the deeper purpose of challenging the social dynamics that allowed people like her to treat others as entertainment in the first place. David wanted Victoria and everyone else present to understand that invisible workers were real people deserving of dignity and respect, but forcing an unwanted marriage would not accomplish that goal and would likely create resentment rather than genuine understanding. As the minutes stretched on and the reality of their situation continued to sink in for everyone present, David made a decision that surprised even himself with its complexity and moral sophistication. He had won the poker game and proven his point about assumptions and human dignity, but the real victory would come from how he chose to use his unexpected position of power. "Mrs. Sterling," David said, his voice carrying a new quality of authority that commanded immediate attention from everyone in the room. "I propose a modification to our original agreement that might serve both our interests better than a forced marriage neither of us actually wants." Victoria's eyes snapped to his face with desperate hope, recognizing that David was offering some kind of escape from the commitment that threatened to destroy her carefully planned life. But there was also wariness in her expression, understanding that someone who had outplayed her so thoroughly at poker was unlikely to offer anything without expecting significant consideration in return. "I'm listening," Victoria replied, her voice carefully controlled as she prepared to negotiate with someone she was beginning to recognize as a far more formidable opponent than she had ever imagined possible. David's proposal would change everything for both of them, but in ways that neither could fully anticipate as they stood on the threshold of a new understanding about power, dignity, and the unexpected places where wisdom and strength could be found in a world that too often judged people by their positions rather than their character. David stood from the poker table with deliberate grace, his movement drawing the attention of every person in the conference room. The weight of his unexpected victory hung in the air like electricity before a storm, and his next words would determine whether this confrontation ended in mutual destruction or something approaching redemption. "My proposal is simple," David began, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had found his moral center after years of drift and uncertainty. "Instead of marriage, I want you to spend 1 month working alongside me. 8 hours each day, performing the same duties I do, seeing this building and the people in it from my perspective." Victoria's eyebrows shot up in disbelief. "You want me to work as a janitor? That's your grand proposal?" "I want you to understand what it means to be invisible in a world where your worth is measured by your job title rather than your character," David replied calmly. 1 month of honest work, no special accommodations, no shortcuts. You'll clean offices, empty trash bins, scrub floors, and experience what it's like to be dismissed and ignored by people who consider themselves your superiors. Sarachan leaned forward with genuine curiosity. "And what happens after the month is over?" David's smile carried a warmth that transformed his entire appearance, revealing glimpses of the man he had been before grief and disappointment had worn away his edges. "After the month, Mrs. Sterling will have honored the spirit of our agreement, and I'll consider the matter settled. She'll return to her executive position with hopefully a deeper understanding of the people who make her comfortable life possible." Marcus Webb shook his head in amazement. You're offering her an escape from marriage in exchange for manual labor? Most people would consider that arrangement heavily in her favor. Most people, David replied thoughtfully, have never had to choose between their pride and their survival. Mrs. Sterling's pride is her most valuable possession, and what I'm asking will cost her more than any financial settlement ever could. Victoria's mind raced through the implications of David's proposal. A month of janitorial work would be professionally humiliating and physically exhausting, but it was infinitely preferable to a forced marriage that would destroy her carefully constructed life. Yet something in David's calm confidence suggested this arrangement would not be as simple as it appeared on the surface. There would have to be conditions, Victoria said carefully, her legal training asserting itself as she began to negotiate the terms of her own humiliation. I can't simply disappear from my executive responsibilities for a month without explanations that would damage Sterling Enterprises. David nodded as if he had anticipated this objection. You'll work the night shift, as I do. Your days will remain free for your executive duties, though you might find yourself too tired to perform both jobs with your usual efficiency. That will be part of the learning experience. The casual way David dismissed her concerns about maintaining her professional effectiveness made Victoria realize that he understood exactly how difficult this arrangement would be. He was not offering her an easy escape, he was proposing a different kind of punishment that would challenge her in ways she had never experienced. And what guarantee do I have that you won't use this month to further humiliate me or sabotage my business interests? Victoria asked, her suspicious nature asserting itself despite her desperate need to find a way out of their original agreement. David's response carried the weight of absolute sincerity. You have my word, Mrs. Sterling. I have no interest in destroying your business or causing you harm beyond what's necessary to fulfill our agreement. My goal is education, not revenge. The distinction between education and revenge was subtle but crucial, and Victoria found herself studying David's weathered face for any sign of deception or hidden malice. What she saw instead was something far more unsettling than anger or vindictiveness. She saw genuine concern for her moral development, as if he actually cared whether she learned something meaningful from their confrontation. Sarah Chen, who had been listening to the negotiation with growing respect for David's psychological sophistication, finally spoke up. David, I have to ask, why are you doing this? You won the poker game fair and square. You could force Victoria to honor her original bet or accept any financial settlement she offers. Why choose this particular form of resolution? David turned his attention to Sarah with the same patient focus he had maintained throughout the evening's increasingly complex developments. Because money changes nothing, Miss Chen. Mrs. Sterling could write me a check for any amount I named, and tomorrow she would return to treating service workers exactly as she did before our poker game. A forced marriage would only create resentment without understanding. But working alongside someone, seeing the world from their perspective, that has the potential to create genuine change. His words carried the conviction of someone who had spent considerable time thinking about the relationship between experience and empathy, between punishment and redemption. Victoria found herself simultaneously impressed by his moral clarity and annoyed by his assumption that she needed moral improvement. You're very sure of yourself for someone whose biggest decision each day used to be which bathroom to clean first, Victoria replied, her defensive anger flaring despite her recognition that such attacks had been ineffective throughout their poker confrontation. David's smile was sad rather than offended. I've made much bigger decisions than that, Mrs. Sterling, and lived with the consequences when I made the wrong choices. That's why I understand the difference between actions that feel satisfying in the moment and choices that lead to genuine growth and healing over time. The philosophical depth of his response reminded everyone present that David Rodriguez remained largely a mystery despite the evening's revelations about his poker skills. His ability to articulate complex moral concepts with such clarity suggested education and life experience that extended far beyond anything they had imagined about someone in his position. Victoria realized that her attempts to dismiss or belittle David were not only failing but were actually revealing the limitations of her own emotional intelligence and moral development. He was responding to her attacks with patience and wisdom while she was reacting like a petulant child whose superiority had been challenged by uncomfortable truths. Fine, Victoria said finally, her voice carrying the resignation of someone accepting the least terrible option among a series of unpalatable choices. 1 month of night shift janitorial work alongside you. But I want clear parameters for what constitutes fulfilling our agreement, and I want assurance that my business reputation won't be unnecessarily damaged by whatever arrangements you have in mind. David's expression remained neutral as he considered her conditions. The work speaks for itself, Mrs. Sterling. You'll know you've fulfilled the agreement when you can perform every task I do with the same competence and professionalism. As for your reputation, that will depend entirely on how you choose to conduct yourself during our month together. The subtle warning in his words made Victoria understand that her behavior during the coming month would be observed and evaluated according to standards she had never had to meet before. David was not simply requiring her to perform manual labor, he was expecting her to demonstrate the same dignity and respect for others that she demanded for herself. Marcus Webb, who had been contemplating the evening's events with the stunned fascination of someone witnessing a complete reversal of everything he thought he understood about social dynamics, finally found his voice. This has been the most extraordinary poker game I've ever witnessed. David, I don't know who you really are, but you've given all of us something important to think about regarding how we treat the people who work for us. David's acknowledgement was gracious but pointed. Everyone deserves to be seen and valued for who they are rather than dismissed based on their job title or social position. Tonight was just a reminder that making assumptions about people's worth and capabilities can lead to very expensive mistakes. The comment was directed at Victoria but applied to everyone present, a gentle challenge to examine their own prejudices and blind spots regarding the invisible workers who maintain their comfortable worlds. Saracen was already mentally reviewing her own interactions with service staff, recognizing patterns of casual dismissal that she had never consciously considered before. As the immediate arrangements were discussed and settled, David found himself experiencing something he had not felt since Isabella's death, a sense of purpose that extended beyond mere survival and routine maintenance of his basic needs. Confronting Victoria's casual cruelty had awakened something in him that went beyond personal vindication. It had reminded him that he possessed the knowledge and experience to make a meaningful difference in how people treated each other. Victoria, meanwhile, was beginning to understand that her month of manual labor would be far more challenging than the physical demands of cleaning and maintenance work. David's calm confidence suggested that he intended to use their time together to systematically dismantle her assumptions about class, worth, and human dignity through direct experience rather than abstract lectures. The poker game that had started as cruel entertainment had evolved into something approaching a moral education program, with David as the unlikely teacher and Victoria as his reluctant but captive student. Neither of them could fully anticipate how profoundly the experience would change them both, but the foundation had been laid for a transformation that would extend far beyond their immediate agreement. 3 weeks into their arrangement, Victoria Sterling discovered muscles in her back and shoulders that she had never known existed. Her manicure hands had developed calluses, and her designer work clothes had been replaced by practical uniforms that could withstand the demands of serious physical labor. More significantly, her perspective on the corporate world she had dominated for so many years was undergoing a fundamental shift that surprised her with its depth and emotional impact. Working alongside David had proven to be far more educational than she had anticipated. His knowledge of the building's operations was encyclopedic, his efficiency was remarkable, and his interactions with other night shift workers revealed a complex social network of mutual respect and support that existed completely outside her awareness during her executive duties. David had kept his word about treating their arrangement as education rather than revenge. He was patient with her mistakes, generous with his knowledge, and careful never to put her in situations that would unnecessarily damage her professional reputation. But he was also uncompromising in his expectations for her performance and behavior, requiring her to meet the same standards of professionalism and dignity that he brought to his own work. The most profound revelation for Victoria had been discovering how differently people treated her when she was wearing a janitor's uniform instead of expensive business attire. Executives who had courted her favor when she was Victoria Sterling, CEO, walked past her without acknowledgement when she was Victoria the cleaning lady. The casual dismissal and occasional rudeness she experienced was eye-opening in ways that no amount of theoretical discussion about class and privilege could have achieved. On their final night together, as Victoria finished mopping the executive conference room where their poker game had taken place exactly 1 month earlier, David appeared with 2 cups of coffee and a quiet smile that suggested their time together had been as meaningful for him as it had been transformative for her. "I owe you an apology," Victoria said, accepting the coffee gratefully and settling into one of the leather chairs she had cleaned hundreds of times during the past month. "Everything you said that night about dignity and respect was absolutely correct. I treated you terribly, and I'm sorry." David's response was immediate and sincere. "Thank you for saying that, Mrs. Sterling. It takes courage to acknowledge when we've been wrong about something important." Victoria found herself laughing despite the exhaustion that had become her constant companion. "Please, after everything we've been through together, I think you can call me Victoria. We've moved well beyond formal business relationships." The casual invitation to first-name intimacy represented a significant shift in how Victoria thought about social hierarchies and professional relationships. David's patient teaching and unwavering dignity had earned her respect in ways that wealth and power never could, and she was beginning to understand that genuine authority came from character rather than position. "What happens now?" Victoria asked, genuinely curious about how their unusual relationship would evolve once their formal agreement was completed. "I return to my executive duties, you continue with your maintenance work, and we pretend this month never happened?" David's smile carried warmth and something that might have been hope. "That's up to you, Victoria. You fulfilled our agreement completely and honorably. What you do with what you've learned is your choice to make." Victoria understood that David was offering her the opportunity to demonstrate whether their month together had created genuine change in her character or simply temporary compliance with unusual circumstances. The real test of their time together would be how she treated service workers and invisible employees when she returned to her position of power and privilege. The transformation that began with a cruel poker bet had evolved into something neither participant could have anticipated, a genuine friendship built on mutual respect and hard-won understanding. Victoria Sterling had discovered that her assumptions about worth and capability were dangerously flawed, while David Rodriguez had rediscovered his own capacity for meaningful connection with another human being. 6 months later, Sterling Enterprises announced the establishment of a comprehensive employee dignity initiative, with improved wages and working conditions for all service staff, regular recognition programs for behind-the-scenes workers, and mandatory sensitivity training for all management personnel. Victoria had used her influence and resources to create systemic change rather than simply modifying her own behavior, demonstrating that genuine learning could lead to institutional transformation. David continued his night shift maintenance work, but with a new sense of purpose and connection to his community. Victoria had recommended him for a supervisory position that came with better pay and benefits, though she had been careful to present the opportunity as recognition of his existing capabilities rather than charity from a grateful executive. Their unlikely friendship had become a reminder that meaningful change was possible when people were willing to see beyond surface appearances and social categories to recognize the full humanity in everyone they encountered. The poker game that started as cruel entertainment had become the foundation for a deeper understanding of dignity, respect, and the transformative power of genuinely seeing and valuing other people. On quiet nights when their shifts overlapped, Victoria and David would sometimes share coffee in the conference room where their confrontation had begun, discussing philosophy, sharing stories about their very different life experiences, and marveling at how a single hand of cards had changed both their lives in ways they could never have imagined possible. The janitor's secret skill had been revealed not just as poker expertise, but as the wisdom to understand that true victory came not from defeating opponents but from creating opportunities for mutual growth and understanding. Victoria's cruel game had awakened something in David that extended far beyond card-playing ability. It had reminded him of his capacity to teach, to lead, and to make a meaningful difference in how people treated each other. Their story became a quiet legend within Sterling Enterprises, whispered among employees who had witnessed the gradual transformation of their CEO from a distant and sometimes cruel executive into someone who knew the names of cleaning staff and maintenance workers, who asked about their families and showed genuine interest in their lives beyond their job functions. The poker table remained in the conference room, a reminder that assumptions about human worth and capability could be dangerously expensive, and that wisdom and strength could be found in the most unexpected places when people were willing to look beyond surface appearances to see the full complexity and dignity of every human being they encountered. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.